Sheldon Wolin, in Democracy Incorporated, described our society's institutions as having evolved in such a manner that they limit the influence of what Lippmann elsewhere called the bewildered herd, while protecting the interests of the elite or specialized class, which dovetails with many of the themes you've discussed as well. For example, in Manufacturing Consent, as you likely remember, along with Edward Herman, you discussed mass media and its ability to naturally limit success within it to the individuals who demonstrate an internalization of and fealty to the prevailing accepted myths and perspectives of elites. So Wolin, as you may or may not know, calls such a system inverted totalitarianism, a form of totalitarianism which rules through subtle coercion as opposed to overt brutality. So my first question is, would you consider the United States a totalitarian state, either inverted or otherwise?
No, I think that's a vast exaggeration. Also, it's not quite accurate about Lippmann.
Okay.
The reason that book was called Manufacturing Consent was because we borrowed the phrase from Walter Lippmann, who was in favor of manufacturing consent.
Right.
His position was that manufacturing consent is a new art in the practice of democracy, because in his view, elites ought to rule, and the general public were what he called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders,
right,
who should just be observers, spectators, while the responsible men like him should be in the position to make decisions and control things, and they have to be protected from what he called the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. So actually it's the other way around. He was a strong advocate of the system that Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. But I think the phrase is misleading.
Okay.
There's a big difference between facing a terrorist security force and facing advertising. There's quite a difference, and we shouldn't minimize that difference.
Right.
There are lots of techniques of intellectual self-defense that don't work when security forces come in and want to blow your head off, or in a torture chamber. There's a very significant difference. And what actually happened is that roughly a century ago, in the freest countries in the world, Britain and the United States, it began to be recognized by elites that they're losing the power to control by force. That too much freedom was being won by popular struggle. It wasn't being given, it was won by hard struggle. So you were getting things like labor movements, parliamentary labor parties, women starting to get the right to vote. And the general public was beginning to free itself from coercion. And therefore you had to find other ways to control people. And the other ways are what Lippmann advocated, controlling attitudes and opinions. And that's the beginning of the growth of a huge industry, the public relations industry, which is, in fact, in its early days in the 1920s, when they were kind of more open and honest about it, it was simply called a propaganda industry. The primary text back in the 1920s, actually by an associate of Lippmann's, Edward Bernays, was called propaganda.
Right.
And he was in favor of what he called engineering of consent, basically the same idea. The intelligent minorities have to control things, and it's for the good of the population. One of the founders of American political science, Harold Lasswell, said around the same time, we should not be deluded by democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not, we are. And so we have to control their attitudes and opinions. We have to drive them to mindless consumerism. We have to fabricate wants. We have to atomize them, separate them from one another, break down associations, like have to destroy unions and so on. We have to change the public education system, so as to quote some of their followers a little bit later, we have to improve the indoctrination of the young. It's the reaction, the liberal reaction to the 1960s. And I should say that I'm quoting just progressives. Lippmann, Bernays, Lasswell, Trilateral Commission, they're all progressives. That's Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Carter, liberals. You go to the right, and it's much harsher.
Right.
So it's much more interesting to look at the liberal end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But it's fundamentally the same. It's just too dangerous to let people make their own decisions. We have to control them, like you have to control a 3-year-old. Even let them run around in the streets. So it's for their good. And then the only question is, well, who runs it?
Right.
A totalitarian state, the dictator runs it, and he uses force. And in a more democratic society, force is, it's still there, but it's much less available. Like in the modern United States, the force is available against people without privilege.
Right.
So if you're a black kid in the ghetto, let's say, yeah, force is available. But for people like us, it's very limited. And we should recognize that we're privileged. We have a lot of privilege. We can resist violence to a very substantial degree. And then come the more subtle means, which are significant. We shouldn't downplay them. I agree with Poulin that they're significant, but to say that they're a form of totalitarianism, I think, is it mistakes great differences. So you take a look at that painting over there. You see what totalitarianism is.
Right.
That's a depiction of U.S.-trained, U.S.-armed security forces, which are blowing out the brains of leading intellectuals in El Salvador in 1989. We don't hear about that. That's part of manufacturing consent.
Right.
But it happened. And there's a big difference between being one of those Jesuit intellectuals and sitting here in this office.
That's right.
Big difference.
Chris Hedges talks about how there is an apparatus that exists currently in the country with the NSA monitoring and all of these developments that have happened that create an atmosphere sort of ripe for the rise of totalitarianism, traditional totalitarianism. How alarmed are you at the prospect of that?
That's up to us. It certainly doesn't have to. And in fact, it's already being somewhat undermined. So yes, it creates the atmosphere, and it's not new. Nothing new about it. So in the 1960s, there was an FBI operation. FBI are the National Political Police. That's serious. And most of their activities, incidentally, are devoted to dissent and independence of thought and so on. That was shown, for example, in the media files that were liberated. Recently, some discussion of that. The content of those was quite interesting. This is the Maine FBI Center for Eastern Pennsylvania. And most of their activities were devoted to independent thought and activism. A small part about car robberies and smaller about mafia. And that's what they are. Well, in the 1960s, there was a program organized by the executive, the presidents, all the way down, COINTELPRO, which was designed to, at first it was, back in the late 50s, attacking the Communist Party, then the American Indian movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the black movements, the New Left, the women's movement, finally just about all critical opposition to state power. And it was no joke. That actually did go as far as political assassination. That not of people like us, but of a black organizer in the Chicago ghetto. Fred Hampton was murdered by a essentially Gestapo-style attack set up by the FBI. Okay, that's totalitarianism, but that's the black ghetto. And that was much worse than anything that's happening now. It was finally stopped by court order around the mid-'70s. What's happening, surveillance is a bad news, but it's not that. We should make these distinctions, and it's easier to overcome. First of all, it's not as destructive. So you don't want to have your phone. Just take a look at the way it's working. Just a couple of days ago, Glenn Greenwald's new media outlet published their first piece based on Snowden revelations, and it was very interesting. What it showed is that these NSA techniques for tracing people by looking at their mobile phones and so on are being used for the assassination program. Obama has a global assassination program, the biggest global terrorism program in the world. Nobody supports it except in the United States. And how are they finding targets, people they want to kill, they decide they're going to kill? Well, like do things like they use the NSA programs to trace where they are, their mobile phones, anything you use, any information you can use about them, and then they kill them. But they don't necessarily kill them. Like maybe I lent you my mobile phone, okay, they kill you. That's how the assassination program works, and him because he's standing next to you.
Right.
Okay, that's quite different from checking where you and I are going. Like who am I? Like maybe your phone is on now, so okay, they can tell that we're talking to each other. That's nowhere near as bad as being assassinated. We should make those distinctions. Mm-hmm. And so yes, it's all wrong, and it should be dismantled. We should also ask some questions about it. The pretext is security, but security is an interesting word. Security for whom? I mean, if you study international relations theory, they tell you that a prime concern of governments is security, maybe the prime concern, but they don't tell you security for whom. Like, is it security for the population? There's overwhelming evidence that that's not a high priority. Take, say, the drone program again. That's creating dangers for the U.S. population. It's generating terrorists faster than they're killing suspects, and they know it. Take, say, the nuclear weapons programs. They're not defending the population.
So why do they persist on...
Because there's a different kind of security involved. Two kinds. One kind of security is security of state power from its own population. Mm. The state is always trying to protect itself from the domestic enemy. They don't want people to know what they're up to. And a large part of the security system is that. I've spent a lot of time, maybe you have, in going through declassified documents. You read through those documents, you find not very much is connected with national security in the usual sense. Mostly it's keeping from the population, keeping secret what we're doing, like the secrecy over NSA. Mm-hmm. Are they keeping it secret from Al-Qaeda? No, they know what's going on. They're keeping it secret from you and me because they don't want the population to know what they're doing. That's one kind of security. The other kind of security is what you see right at this moment in international negotiations over what's called trade, though it isn't really trade, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. That's being done in secret, mm-hmm. partially. It's secret from the population. It's not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the legislation. Right. And you can imagine what kind of legislation they're writing. But it has to be kept secret from the population because you have to protect the security of the corporate sector. You have to protect the security of the wealthy and the powerful. That's an important, because they're the ones who sort of dominate the society and even run the political system pretty much. Mm-hmm. So you've got a kind of security, but it's not national security. Right. And in fact, this came out pretty strikingly with the Snowden revelations. You may recall that the first reaction of the government, Keith Alexander, the general in charge, was that he was asked, what have they done? He said, well, they stopped. He said, I think 54 terrorist operations. And there were further inquiries, and he cut it down to 8. And finally, he cut it down to 1. And that one terrorist operation was some guy who gave $8,000 to some charity in Somalia. That's what the system has achieved. Right. There was recently an interesting statement by Adlai Stevenson III, a senator who was for years in charge of, it was on these senatorial committees for intelligence, and back in the 70s, the 80s, he discusses what they did. He said, first of all, the intelligence was mostly irrelevant. They were getting everything wrong. He said what we needed was cerebral intelligence, the ability to think. and not take information from the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, which is shaped to mislead us for their interests, not signal intelligence, which doesn't tell you anything. And they missed all the significant things, like they missed the fall of the Shah, they missed the end of the Soviet Union. Robert Gates just wrote his memoirs, and he condemned, it was all over the newspapers, he condemned Joseph Biden for getting everything wrong. And how about Gates? Gates was a Russian specialist. That's what he was trained in. Soviet specialist. Big shot in the CIA. And did he predict the fall of the Soviet Union? He totally missed it. After it happened, he still didn't understand it. This is the top guy in charge of Russian intelligence. Well, that lacks cerebral intelligence, as Stevenson pointed out. Actually, he pointed out that their own investigations did predict the fall of the Shah without intelligence, just by thinking about, by studying what was happening. Okay, the idea that this stuff protects your security should very definitely be challenged, actually for two reasons. One reason is that whenever a government is caught doing something, instantly the plea is security. That's reflexive. Since it's reflexive, it carries no information. It's predictable. So you just disregard it. Mm-hmm. Then you try to look at the facts, put aside the protestations. When you look at the facts, it turns out security doesn't have much to do with it, except security in a special sense. Security of the state from its own citizens, and security of the powerful domestic elements in the state, which in our society are the corporate sector primarily. Now you go back to a real totalitarian state, it's different. They're also protecting their security, but there it's clear what it is. The state and the powerful segments within it are basically identical, and they're using force to protect their security. So it's kind of transparent. In a society like ours, it's you got to think a little bit. You have to use cerebral intelligence, take Stevenson's words, to figure out what's going on. But it's not quantum physics. I mean, anybody can figure it out if they stop to think about it. But just as you can think about, there are things that aren't talked about that are massively significant. So, like, you took an economics course when you were in college, right? Mm-hmm. So you were taught that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. That leads to the marvels of markets. You turn on the television set, and what do you see? You see huge efforts being made to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices. A huge part of the economy is devoted to undermining markets and instead to controlling people. I mean, that ought to be the first thing that you're taught in an economics course. That ought to be chapter 1. Mm-hmm. And you don't even have to prove it. Just tell people, look at your TV set, and it's immediately obvious. But those things are, it's not conscious deception. They're ideologically suppressed. Part of the ideology is to suppress what's happening. And it's not that anyone's kind of trying to do it. It's just, it's built in. You've learned it. Actually, George Orwell had some nice comments about it. You read Animal Farm when you were... Okay,
way back in high school.
Back in high school. But you didn't read the introduction to Animal Farm. And the reason is it was suppressed. It was discovered years later in Orwell's unpublished papers. And it's kind of interesting. In the introduction, he says, look, this book is a satire of the totalitarian enemy. But he said, in free England, it's not all that different. He said, in England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And then he talks a little about the way it's done. He says, partly it's that the press is owned by wealthy men who have every reason to want ideas to be suppressed. But there's a stronger reason, a good education. He said, if you've gone through, the good schools, Oxford and Cambridge, you have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. Like, for example, that a huge part of the economy is devoted to undermining markets. or that people should not be allowed to make their own decisions. We have to control them. It just wouldn't do to say that. It's not a sort of a conscious choice not to say it. Like, it's not that your economics professor was trying to hide something. It's just you have a good education. It's internalized. You know you don't say things like that. Mm-hmm. Just like the press knows, for example, that it doesn't report, zero reporting, of a very important study that came out a month ago. One of the major international polling organizations did a study in which they asked people which country in the world is the greatest threat to world peace. And guess who won? Not even close. The U.S. was far and away above anyone else. Way down below was second place Pakistan, which was inflated by the Indian vote. Iran, you couldn't even find. Well, that's not the kind of thing you say. Nobody told the editors, don't publish that. It's just, you know it. You don't publish things like that. We're supposed to be the beacon of freedom and so on, and Iran is supposed to be the threat. So you can't publish the fact that the whole world looks at it the other way around. Wouldn't do. And this happens all the time. Okay, but that's a lot easier to combat than the security forces who are blowing the brains out of the intellectuals. A lot easier.